Good morning, everyone on YouTube. Welcome into this amazingly early live stream presentation for me. I don't think I've done this early of a presentation since 2020, I think, when we were in lockdown. So this is fantastic to be able to do a early morning one. I hope everyone's got their coffee. I got mine. Trey, what are you drinking this morning? Water? Coffee?
I've got 20 ounces of coffee.
There you go. 20 ounces of coffee. Good to go there. Patrick is getting ready to come in here in a moment. Let me bring him in. We didn't want to keep all of you waiting. So there he is.
Apologies, y'all. Hey, thanks for waiting. Appreciate it.
That's we were just getting things warmed up for you. That's all.
Appreciate the background in the desktop there behind us. That's great.
I've become a Canva pro. It really helps when you can do that kind of stuff. I went to the University of Google to figure out how to do Canva. But it's great to have you guys on because this is a really cool book and a fantastic discussion that I've been actually having with some of my cohort in my doctoral training guys, because I've taken 3 gaming classes in my doctoral training, and that's been fantastic.
That's awesome.
I just enjoyed that. So when I got a copy of your book, Playing at War, Identity and Memory in Civil War Video Games, shout out to LSU Press for getting this through customs to me, and making sure that I think this might have been the first copy in Canada. I'm not sure about that.
We're going to claim it as such.
Yeah.
We're going to claim it. Yeah. But I was so happy to receive it because it brought back some memories, and I want to go over that with both of you guys and talk about some major issues that we've also talked about in my classes. So thank you guys both for being here and for hanging out with me for a little while. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. And we've already got our buddy Travis Shaw in the chat here, ready to go. Travis, you should be working. What are you doing? Thank you for being here, everybody. So I need to know, first off, where did the idea for this book come from? Right from the start. We're going to start out that way.
So Patrick and I have a couple of mutual friends who, Matthew Stanley and Matthew Holbert, who are both historians, both Civil War era historians. And so we were sitting in 2019 in Louisville, Kentucky. We were at the annual meeting of the Southern Historical Association, and they have a banquet every year for the Tom Watson Brown Book Prize. And so we were sitting around the supper table with Matt and Patrick and myself and a couple other folks, and just got to talking about a series that the Matts were starting to put together with LSU Press that was looking at martial identity and American popular culture. And so we started somehow the conversation. We were all 30-somethings, mid-30s, late 30s. And the conversation kind of turned to Civil War video games and some of the ways that we encountered them in our youth and what games we played. And finally, I don't know whether it was Patrick or me or both, maybe simultaneously said, this would be great for this series. And so that was kind of the seed of what it turned into. We spent the rest of that conference canvassing the attendees. Hey, did you play Civil War video games when you were young? Would you like to write an essay on one? And then later put out a public call and got a lot of great submissions. And I think it turned out really well. So
I was so excited about that idea that I've got a photo that popped up in my Facebook memories just a week or so ago, of me sitting on my couch on Monday morning after that conference, just sort of researching all these different games and like what different chapters could we do? What could we do with this? And it's funny to think back on that now that idea was born and it was off and running and good timing too, because we got this call out and got, some folks together, not knowing that video games were about the only venue for doing research that any of us were about to have. So as the world shut down,
I think we posted that call in late January, early February of 20. Yeah. And then the whole world shut down mid-March. So within a month. So yeah, it was fortuitous that way.
No wonder I didn't see the call. I was sick with COVID.
Yeah, right. Like it was really, I remember distinctly, when all of these essays were rolling in, sitting on my couch and editing them and, figuring out, we had a new IT guy at work that started the Friday that everything shut down. And one of the first interactions I had with him was like, hey, can I get the admin password to install a bunch of pirated old games on my work laptop? I swear this is legit.
For research.
For research purposes. 100% for research.
Right.
Yes. I had a very similar conversation with our IT department.
Yeah, I've been talking about these games with some of my cohort and some of those in the digital humanities department, because I'm actually doing DH and technology for my PhD. And so we've been discussing some of these ideas and thoughts on this, because I think I was one of the first 5 historians who were streaming on Twitch. And back in the day, and I'm saying back during the COVID era of the lockdown era. So to see this come to fruition out of the COVID era seems fitting, because some of us were trying to, tell people about the differences between games and reality and stuff. And I actually did a video where we did a partial battlefield tour, and then I went into the game to talk about landscape. So this is really fitting for everything that came out of the COVID lockdown era, I think, because now we're talking about games more than ever, I think. And how have you seen that response, guys, from your colleagues, especially in the SHA and others who have read it, have talked about it, have discussed it with you? Because at one point, I don't think this book, maybe 15 years ago, this book wouldn't have come out. What's new with this, as far as how we see it, how we see this kind of research?
Yeah, no, I feel like this really does. Well, you look just at the sort of the money that people plow into games, right? And just as if you just add up the investment that people across the world are making in this type of entertainment, it's blowing away traditional forms of engagement with the past, right? Who's spending this on battlefield tours? It ain't happening, right? And so I think there's an argument there, and just sort of a recognition that the medium has come of age, that it's been through now a number of iterations, right? And the span of this book, takes us from at the most ambitious, the late 70s, early 80s through the present. But man, you think about the evolution in capacity, just of the technology. The generational change that's happened now, there's a lot to reflect upon. I think for me, one of the things that came out of this a lot that surprised me a little bit was how rooted our sort of framework for talking about Civil War memory was in the late 80s, early 90s. The scholars' perception of the ways that the public remembers the war are still stuck in that Ken Burns glory Gettysburg moment. And man, there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. And that's really one of the great things about this book. It has nothing at all to do with video games, is especially in the chapters that cover more recent titles, we're really poking at what are the new and emerging edges of a new Civil War memory now. The landscape has shifted in recent presidential administrations and political movements, and people aren't engaging with the war in this sort of centennial boomer through the 90s framework, and that's new. And I don't know that we got all the answers there, and we didn't really try to. but it was just saying that, like, man, I'm just not seeing this model working anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the lines are so blurred to where the categories, are beginning to, they're not explaining more than they are explaining, I think.
Yeah.
And how we think about Civil War memory. One of the things that's really interesting when just in terms of reactions from even people, who are trained historians and in academia and that we see at conferences, it's kind of two poles. It's either there are Civil War video games, like even the number of people who are familiar with the Civil War historically, scholarship, and even pop culture, film and fiction, are like, wait, there's more than one, like pressing people to name one game franchise, I think. Or it's the complete opposite. It's the other end of the spectrum. It was like, oh, I played, do y'all have a chapter on? And they talk about sort of going through the evolution of the games that we chart in the book in their youth, starting on 8-bit or 16-bit console games, and then moving to PC games, and then moving to online streaming, and it's sort of a lifelong pursuit. So that's been really interesting to me, is just topically how people respond, and I think that definitely, I think, is even more pronounced outside of the academy and conference circles. When I just tell people what I'm working on, they're like, you're doing a book on that? There are enough games to do that with. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, to some people it's seen as very niche, but to some people it's seen as part of their own identity from what they remember when they were kids, or reenactors who couldn't get out to the field that weekend or whatever.
Yeah.
And it was really a really interesting thing. It came to fruition a lot came to fruition for many of us during the lockdown, because you started seeing reenacting units forming reenacting units in a digital way, and they were digitizing their own way of doing things that used to be weekend events. But when we look at the kind of the history of Civil War video games, guys, we're also looking at, as you said, Patrick, we're also looking at memory and historical memory, and how popular culture really gets in deep and entrenched in some of these games as well, like the Ken Burns series and Glory and Gettysburg, basically the trifecta of Civil War history in the early 90s, at least. What's some of those games that really started the pathway towards what we see today, guys, that your authors in this edited work went over, that you really saw as being an asset to the book?
So we had we actually we fought to keep one of the chapters in, because there was some question when it went through peer review as to whether or not it fit topically. But we had a whole chapter on the Oregon Trail and its evolution. And sort of we framed it as sort of crucial, not only topically, because obviously, a lot of the sectional crisis is fueled by what's happening in the West, right? So a game that engages with westward expansion is inherently sort of, I think it speaks to, the Civil War era in a broad sense. But also technologically, so many of the inroads in gamifying history were made in the production and sort of the evolution of that game's design and production process. And so I thought John Legg did a really great job kind of charting that and showing sort of the evolution, both in the context and in the game itself. And then the chapter I did on North and South, which was for regular NES, came out on Atari and Commodore, but really became popular in the United States on the regular NES system in 1990. And so that game to me was sort of a moment where they're taking a lot of the mechanics of the old cardboard and paper board games from the Centennial, so the strategic strategy game format and the mechanics of that, and digitizing it essentially. But they're also incorporating some of the more recent arcade games and the rolling screen and the single player, and you overcome obstacles to get to an inline or a boss or whatever. That game has both of those elements and is really one of the first games to bring both of those elements into a single game format. And I mean, there are a lot of issues with the game's content and the way it's framed, but for 8-bit processing technology, it does a lot. And I think is pretty impressive in that sense, and really kind of sets the tone for some later games that have a little more computing capability to build upon.
And yeah, I think it's so impressive that given those technological limitations, they had that strategic level, they had that tactical level where you could fight battles, and then they had that arcade style. Just like it's a lot to program in there, and for it all to hold together, just technologically is really impressive. At the time. I think, for me, kind of the follow-up, there's one really important one, and a kind of a conversation that we had internally with the authors, sort of in groups, but then also one-on-one, was, what's the experience of playing these games at the time? And so, I was really impressed with kind of the follow-up chapter in some ways to John Legg's on Oregon Trail was Nick Sacco's on this game Freedom, which was also produced by MECC, the Minnesota Educational Computing Cooperative or something like that. That was trying to gamify the Underground Railroad. And this was nobody had heard of this until Nick wrote a short blog post about it, and then we got him to expand that into a chapter. And, the reason that people had no memory of this game is because it got such fierce pushback that it got recalled. And MEC pulled those discs back, and they were in, I don't remember what the statistic was. I want to say it was in a third of American school districts or something. They recalled them all and scrapped them. And part of that was because there was pushback from particularly African-American families who, felt that gamifying the Underground Railroad was problematic in itself, even though MEC had worked with Black scholars and activists to sort of do as good a job of incorporating different elements as they could. They thought they had done a good, inclusive, sort of preparation and rollout work. But it came down to the kind of the lived experience of how you played games in the early 90s. And there wasn't a connection between a history curriculum that supported students and could help flesh out the broader context of this game, and the way that you walked down with your class to a computer lab that was separate from your classroom in most cases, and you played computer games. And so, what it would lead to inevitably was, a bunch of kids go down to the computer lab, they play as this Underground Railroad, and then all of a sudden, the Black student, particularly, in a school district where there were not many Black students, getting relentlessly bullied and called racial epithets, etc., by these majority white classrooms, and it was a mess. And so they pulled it. But that came down to sort of this experience of how one plays games. And we also talked about that with Oregon Trail. Again, sort of talking with scholars and sort of, you got to put yourself in the seat of somebody who's playing this game. And how they're experiencing that. My chapter was on Sid Meier's Gettysburg, as I noticed in that background, a classic. And it was so much fun to write, right? Because I just wallowed in that nostalgia for me of that movie, which just permeated everything in my world growing up. Like that was that was my Iliad. In a lot of ways, and sort of seeing the ways that game really capitalized on that hype of Civil War interest in the early 90s and really tied that in. But then also one of the sort of the technically most interesting things for me was, thinking through and recognizing. I just sort of went back into the code and sort of followed out the scenario trees and what would happen if this outcome occurred, and how could you create Confederate decisive victories, and what does that mean, and how does the game play that out? Where are they drawing from? Sort of diving into that behind the scenes of how exactly did they imagine different scenarios, and how did they set up Gettysburg to be this potentially decisive moment that perhaps as Civil War historians we know it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was something that I thought about while I was going through it, because obviously that particular game was the one for me. Travis in chat says North and South was his foundational part of his childhood. Mine was Sid Meier's Gettysburg. And there are several times in the book where the authors of each chapter talk about how, these aren't educational in themselves, but it does pique curiosity for some of us. I mean, that piqued my curiosity as far as I want to go out and see the battlefield, or I want to, do whatever. I want to read a book about this. Patrick, it piqued your interest. I'm sure, Trey, there was one out there, if not this one, that piqued your interest as well, and got us curious and made us even more nerdy than we were before. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if we totally understood that it wasn't educational in a way, because I still have students who come up to me and talk to me about the Second World War or something, and they're telling me facts off of a Call of Duty game or something like that, and it's like up to us to say, hey, that's not history, that's a game, but it piques their interest. Do you think that is more of the moral of the story in that aspect, where if we were weighing so much on the education side and saying it's not educational, therefore maybe we don't put this in a professional journal, or we don't do a book about this like they would have said 20 years ago, we need to be talking about this actually impacted our lives, so it must have some sort of effect in some way on identity or memory or something like that?
I think so, for sure. I think in the same way that, there was pushback on really engaging with literature, especially fiction as a site, or film, right? Like considering these things beyond the entertainment value that they're obviously primarily designed for, but also as sites where historical content is conveyed in a particular way, and that conveyance has an impact, has consequences, right, for how we engage with history. And so I think in that sense that video games are the next frontier of studying historical memory and popular culture. And I mean, Call of Duty would be a huge one for how we remember, early 20th century, conflicts and American wars and the global scale of it and technology and all that stuff, right? But I think you could do that for any historical period, and especially any historical conflict that has been gamified. Mm-hmm. But one of the things we talk about in the book, and several of the chapters kind of discuss, is the games can be useful because of the inherent contingency that's built into them, right? Like, you as the gamer are making decisions that affect the outcome in a way that just isn't the case with film, consuming film or fiction, right? Like that path is charted for you, I guess, unless you're reading a choose your own adventure book, but I don't, but even that,
I had one of those about Gettysburg.
Yeah. Maybe more similar in that, you make a choice and then there are multiple consequences, but still within certain parameters, right? That's what games are doing. They're creating a world, mm-hmm. but you are the historical actor. And so I do think it has educational value if it's supplemented and contextualized with actual historical curriculum. And I think that's the point that Nick makes about freedom, that John Legg makes about Oregon Trail. We all kind of, these games can be useful, and that's why I think having game studies and having these types of games as part of an analysis in school programs, if it's done right, it can actually sort of be really useful to kind of bring up discrepancies or inconsistencies or blind spots or whatever in how we engage with the past. I think in really productive and fruitful ways, but it also, there are a lot of pitfalls on that path, right? That are easy to fall into for lack of time, lack of resources, whatever. So kind of the double-edged sword.
And John, it makes me think of you were talking about people quoting Call of Duty facts to you, and like you, I came up in the reenacting world, and so anything I did on electronically was a supplement to going out on weekends and obsessing about uniforms and weapons and things like that. And I think that's actually really important, is what these games point to is kind of in a lot of ways a broader misunderstanding of what knowing about the past is. Like there's a level where, and we know this from reenactors, but it's with buffs of any kind, right? Knowing about uniforms and personalities of commanders and weapons, and how far can this shoot with what sort of accuracy at range does a smoothbore versus a unit equipped with rifled muskets, what's that damage factor, how much should we multiply for being up on top of little round top, etc. Like all of these things are useful to know, and especially if you're trying to gamify those, you've got to quantify those. That's a debatable historical inquiry. But we also shouldn't confuse that for understanding. That's knowledge. That's not understanding, right? And that's what a lot of the games sort of struggle to do. And I think, quite frankly, that's what a lot of classroom education struggles to do, right? Like, what do you do with that understanding and that knowledge, right? And that's where, we had a great chapter about sort of the emotional context that the manuals try to set for these games, because ultimately the game authors, the programmers, understand that they can only do so much, and that there has to be this greater emotional context, especially in earlier games, that has to be set there. And that's, I feel like we really struggle as historians when we engage the public to not just sort of inform, but to build this bigger, like, okay, but what does that mean? What's at stake here for this fragile American republic? All these big questions that we face in the present as well. Those are more difficult to model. And those are more dependent on the human factor of the player supplying that if they can.
Yeah, I totally. I mean, that's a huge part of the mission of the book, in my opinion, with everyone writing in and doing that and talking about that. Randolph, I still play Civ. It's one of those things.
Oh, yeah.
Never played Pirates though.
Oh, Pirates is the best.
I never played it.
I did a book talk last week, and it was at a campus down here, and they have an esports team, which I didn't know was a thing, but apparently they're very good. And once somebody asked about the Sid Meier's, the whole catalog, and Pirates was one. I was like, I've never played Pirates.
Yeah.
I don't know how I missed that one. But
I had my entire fraternity hooked on Pirates because I got it when the relaunch of it when we were in college, and we would just like groups of us would sit around a computer for hours and watch somebody sail about the Caribbean and collectively.
To have that much time on our hands.
Right. Yeah. But here's the thing, right? Like my understanding of Caribbean geography and the geopolitics of the 17th century is still pretty much based on pirates, right? Like you can tell me a lot about Sir Francis Drake, and I still kind of remember where he went, only because I had to go sack those same Spanish cities.
Yeah, that chapter in your book, in the book about manuals, was fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because I never considered that aspect before. I always just thought, we're going to talk about games and we're going to discuss what's right and legit about them, what's wrong, and et cetera, et cetera. Never thought to open the manual because I'm a guy and I don't read the directions. Okay. It's just, that's not, I just throw the manual aside and we move on. That to me was one of the fascinating chapters in this where I had to read it a couple times, not because I couldn't read it, but because I was so fascinated and overwhelmed by the fact I never considered this before. Was that one of those things that you feel like there could be a way forward to, have that educational component involved in it? Obviously now it'd be a digital manual because we don't have the old CD-ROM cases and stuff anymore. But that could lead to that educational component that some of these things are lacking, right? We could think of it as the old manual in a way.
And the fascinating thing about that chapter, Katie Brackett had not played. I mean, she's very upfront about that in the chapter. And that was one of the first things. She was actually one of the first people we got on board to do a chapter. And she was like, oh, I'd be really interested in looking at some of the manuals for these games and how they try to like contextualize the games. And I think it was really crucial for most of the games she's looking at. You kind of hit on it there, but some of the later games are digitized, right? They're part of the game. Like you can easily avoid them by not opening that particular menu or file, right? And you don't have to consult it at all. But for those earlier games, that's all you have in terms of trying to set the stage and establish some sort of historical context is what you're doing in that manual. And like you said, easily avoidable. Again, you just get into it and you only go to the manual when you run into a problem, right? But well, how do I fix this, or how do I overcome that? But to me, I think Katie not having really been immersed in these games growing up enabled her to kind of really engage with from a little bit of distance, right? To kind of understand, well, what's going on here, emotionally and just experientially. That when you're doing it, you're not thinking about those things, right? And I think that's true of a lot of the sort of bigger takeaways from a lot of these games as we're analyzing them. Like at the moment that you're kind of the prime target audience for these games, you're not thinking about, well, I wonder why there's no mention of slavery here, right? Like that's not something that you're probably. Now, I think this is something I've talked about with other groups, but I do think now that gaming is not necessarily confined to youth and childhood. Adults play games now. Like there's several generations that have gone up and they continue to play. Gaming culture is very much sort of part of. I think that's changing. Like it was easy to kind of dismiss some of these earlier games because this was mostly sort of something you did in your youth and you grow out of it, so to speak, right? But I don't think that's true anymore. I think that perception of gaming is different, and so we continue to engage with new games that are engaging this content in new ways. And it's we're bringing our past experiences into those experiences, and our expectations of what's in the game and how the game functions are all based on that longer history. And so that's one of the reasons I think continuing to look at games as sites of memory creation. I think the pace of change and sort of how our conception of the past unfolds and evolves is going to increase because there are more people engaged in that process from a lot of different angles now because they just have more opportunity to do so.
Yeah, it's really interesting when we have new technology and new ways of interacting with that technology. That's when you really see historical memory get fluid. Because people are now engaging with something new and they're looking at things from a different perspective. I mean, we have VR, stuff that's out there now where you can walk through Constitution Hall and you can do all this stuff. And now you're engaging with it differently than you would have if you watched 1776. It's just a different perspective. I think we're seeing that with a lot of the gaming things, at least from the students that I talk to who are younger than me. They are engaging with some of this stuff in new ways that I never even considered. VR flight simulators and all this other stuff. So we're going to see this new kind of outlook on the past via how they're interacting with these things. When we were coming up, it was what's on the background here, and it was Sid Meier's, it was other institutions who really, led us in different directions. There are game devs out there who are hiring historians too, and I think that's something that we need to touch on as well, because if they're hiring historians, they're trying to get something right. They're trying to do something right, and I think that's something that we need to be not overlooking, is some devs are actually trying.
Yeah, and that was a lot of one of the things that I took from this and tried to caution authors about as we got those first drafts in, and kind of push back against some of their, it's easy to punch down on games, especially games that are older. And I tried to write this in the introduction as a call for historians to have a little bit of humility. Let's not pretend that we're all not imperfect human beings with invisible biases, invisible to us anyway, who are working from a fragmentary historical record, trying to reconstruct as best we can. And we know that whatever we produce will be superseded in time. We all have that understanding when you are writing a book, when you're doing a museum exhibit. And we need to extend that same grace to these game developers. And there were incidents where an author, again, in earlier drafts would sort of say, how could they not have modeled this? Or why weren't they thinking about this topic? And we would say, okay, so when's the first book, academic book from a university press, that really kind of established this topic as something we all needed to think about? Mm-hmm. That's 5 years after this game was published. So you're asking a game developer to be reading maybe a dissertation that isn't out yet, maybe to be going to academic conferences and to hear that one grad student who's giving a paper that previews like a whole sea change in the way that we talk about X topic or Y topic in the Civil War, right? You wouldn't ding a fellow historian for not having access to that archive yet, for not having that theoretical framework yet, right? So in the context of what was knowable, maybe some of these games are really cutting edge from an interpretive standpoint, from a research standpoint. If we just sort of step back and historicize them and take them in the same way as we would if we were writing a historiographical article.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there have been games that have spawned message boards where people have been, saying, well, this uniform is different than it should be, or the buttons aren't right on this. The stuff we used to argue about in the field when we reenacted, are now on message boards. And I saw this a lot with War of Rights.
Yeah,
that was the one, because it also was one of those that hit at the right time. It was the COVID go-to for a lot of people. There you have a chapter in here on War of Rights, and many of the people who watch me over the years know that I have friends who also play War of Rights. I don't. I think I played it like twice. No, not knocking it. Just I'm like a Sid Meier's guy. That kind of opened new doors, right? Where people were like, they may be complaining in the chat, but behind the scenes there's something else going on.
War of Rights is fascinating, right? And on a couple of different levels. You're absolutely right. As far as sort of figuring out where the next evolution of Civil War memory coming out of our fuzzy, sort of Trump COVID moment, where American, society is headed with understanding its past, the forums there, I think, are kind of the best in video game land for trying to get a sense of where that's leading. Mm-hmm. And Dan Farrell, who wrote that chapter, I think kind of proposes a sort of a new, he calls it a kind of a libertarian cynicism that doesn't align very neatly with Union or Confederate or any of the sort of the clean sort of loyalist emancipationist reconciliationist models that we've got from Civil War memory. So there's a lot to sort of puzzle over there. Again, that's not the last word to be said on what Civil War memory in the early 21st century is going to look like, right. But it is the first marker of somebody saying, "Oh, something's different," and that comes out of those forums. I think War of Rights is fascinating because it facilitates that conversation, because it sort of takes this reenacting model of these self-created units. You drill as a unit is kind of like incorporating the guild system from other gaming platforms and genres. People take on a research identity. They take on a unit identity of some unit that fought in Antietam. And they sort of get into that research and things like that. You sort of formally enlist with one of these units. And then on just the technical level, Civil War games, since probably that awful History Channel game that Chuck Wells co-writes about, and we can dunk on that later. That is the one that's like open season, take your shots.
Yeah.
It's trash.
Yeah.
And he does some really great framing within like History Channel and A&E programming at the time, and turns it into a great chapter. But man, that game was awful. But what they were trying to do, and this is really fascinating, is they just basically said like, oh man, Call of Duty and Medal of Honor are blowing it up right now in terms of showing us 20th century warfare. So we've got to do a Civil War first-person shooter, and it's as bad as you think it can be. War of Rights, look, in terms of modeling, sort of 19th century rifle musket combat in a first-person shooter setting, I don't know. That's about as good as I think you're going to get. The ways that they enforce and give multipliers for staying in a line of battle, the way that you sit there and you're vulnerable while you're reloading that musket, and that's a terrifying thing. Especially, and it's so right for Antietam. They could not have picked a better battle to model, just because you stumble out of the fog or out of the cornfield right on top of an enemy formation, and you're right there in this terror of blasting away at 15 yards. And that's the gaming experience that you get there. It really is impressive. I did not think anybody could do it well until I watched lots of gameplay videos of that.
I think even Earl Hess would be hard pressed to find major flaws with.
Yeah, that would be an interesting chapter. Earl talking
about a social thought experiment right there.
That would be interesting.
Earl Hess playing War of Rights.
Yeah. That has to be a video on YouTube. That would be amazing. The idea of as we say, we'll go back to this for a moment. The idea of identity pops up for me because when I'm playing Ultimate General Civil War, Ultimate General Gettysburg, or even War of Rights, I have to be in blue. The identity is there, where it's like my ancestors wore this, I'm going to wear this, and I'm going to go out there. I find that some other gamers are like that in some ways because they've traced their lineage back to this, or they're reenactors who were in a formation in a Confederate unit or a Union unit, and they want to personify that identity. It carries over into the digital identity, and that carries over into memory a lot of times because I'm remembering my ancestor and doing this. Some may scoff at that, but that's legit digital identity 101, right? And we see that in various games where people connect with what they know of their own past and maybe trying to, personify that legacy in some strange way. War of Rights is one of those that allows people to do that because they have the units available for people. Did you when you went into this, going into this, being gamers previously or having experience with Sid Meier's and others, did you think about that kind of identity being part of the equation or being maybe entrenched with some people? What were your thoughts on that idea of identity? Because as historians, we talk about memory a lot. So what about this idea of identity?
Yeah, I think we encouraged our authors to kind of lead with that, honestly. Like, what were your early encounters with not just the game that you're going to study, but just sort of this genre of games and historical games in general. And so that, as the editors, as all of these were coming in, I think Patrick and I are on the same page. Those were our favorite parts of the chapters, like just at first glance, like where we get a window into how the historian behind the analysis is coming at the game and sort of what emotional and sort of identity experiences are informing it. So I know for me that was crucial. I got deep roots in the deep South, so the historical memory that I received from all the authority figures in my life growing up was not particularly nuanced. It was pretty classic Lost Cause, SCV, and so when I was playing these games, I was playing in gray. I mean, that was a given. Mm-hmm. And so that really was not even a question until I was, much older and continued playing these games and then thinking about them in different ways after I'd, gotten into more of the actual scholarship on historical memory. So that was, but I think that's instructive to kind of know that about a historian, how they've come to understand what they understand through the scholarship, through evidence-based analysis. And then you can kind of see those early experiences, how they were productive and constructive, but also, the holes, the flaws, the pitfalls that were involved. All of it's useful, right? Mm-hmm. If you kind of apply it, using the knowledge that you've gained since that moment. So to me, that was one of the most enjoyable parts of writing our individual essays, but then in reading everyone else's essays.
Mm-hmm.
I in my chapter in the kind of maybe the first page or two, I tell a story that I think gets to this very important distinction between the sort of the passively receiving of watching a movie, right, and sort of imbibing whatever the creator sort of wants you to do, which you can still get emotionally attached to, certainly, but that greater personal investment in I am dictating the future of this game. And this is a different way of engaging, but I remember when Gettysburg would be played on TNT on a Sunday afternoon because they needed to fill time, and I would watch it and I would be upset at the end of it inevitably, because I was always rooting for the Pickett's charge to be successful. My dad made me so mad one time because I came out of my room and he goes, "Well, did we win this time?" And I was probably 10 and I was furious that he could be so flippant about that, because I was in it to win it, man. Like, it came down to the last throw every time. And we had to fight over who gets to use the Faulkner quote about Pickett's charge, and it all comes down to this, and every Southern boy is invested in it and knows it can work this time, because in the first draft, I think probably 2/3 of the chapters had that quote in it, and we said no, only one chapter gets it. But it's true, right? And that is it. That imaginative play that Faulkner's talking about from growing up in Mississippi in the teens or 20s is something that everybody can emotionally invest in. And I think it is so important, like Trey was saying, that we be upfront with that about how why this shapes us. Because you're right, it is the doorway that fascinates certain of us to dedicate our lives to doing this.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because all three of us have had experiences with lost cause issues and stories. I was in a Confederate unit in reenacting who were deeply entrenched in that. And it had to take years for me to overcome that kind of thing where I'm like, hey, this primary source doesn't say that. And moving forward and doing critical thinking and all kinds of stuff. So it's interesting that we're talking about this and talking about how we interact with the digital landscape of a game. And we've all been influenced because we're all growing up in the 90s or late 80s, early 90s when this is in our schools. And we're being told certain things and taught certain things because that was the way it was. And now we see obviously a huge amount of pushback because things evolve and memory's fluid. And we're seeing this in the gaming sphere as well, where we saw it in those chat messages on War of Rights and in those boards. You're starting to see certain messages go away because it's starting to be a pushback. I'm wondering where that's going to lead to the next step, guys, for this kind of a study, this kind of thing where we're going to be embracing finally gaming and history and discussing the pitfalls and the strengths. I'm wondering where that leads to next, guys, and I would love to hear your opinion on that, where, you know, you're not going to be able to look into a crystal ball, but you can see the way that the waves are going as far as your relationship with this digital media and some of the authors and the way they do it. Where do you think this kind of thing is going as far as how we write about this or engage with it?
Well, I think one of the things we kind of lead with in the introduction is a game that came out in 2021, just as we were kind of going into final production for the manuscript. So we didn't have the time to really engage it fully in its own or standalone essay, but it was upon initial glance, Patrick and I were emailing back and forth and was like, have you seen this? It just came out on Steam. So it's called Grand Tactician. And so that came out right as we were putting the finishing touches on everything. And we're like, we have to deal with this. Like, we can't have a book come out on Civil War video games and not deal with, especially since that game, it wasn't kind of a throwaway game that, you know, some of the ones that come up on your Facebook feed or something that are obviously, I mean, they're just rehashing. They're a nostalgia play, right?
Right.
This was actually making a concerted effort to engage in the content in a really deep, substantive way. And so, I mean, as we kind of say in the introduction, that game, if you were to make a laundry list of things, you know, collectively from each of the essays in this book that historians are calling for or criticizing, that game does a lot of what the historians who are analyzing these games call for.
Mm-hmm.
But then you play that game, and Patrick and I both downloaded it and played it just to get a sense of it. You play that game and sort of that axis that we talk about that kind of runs through the fun axis and the educational axis. Like, you really start to see the breaking point, I think, of that axis point, that pivot point, because the game does so much and it demands so much of the gamer that it's kind of a difficult game to play.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's actually a really good game, and it gives you the option to kind of minimize the burden that you carry in playing it, if you want to. Like, you don't have to make all the economic policy decisions, right? You don't have to make all of the political appointment decisions. You can kind of pick and choose what you want to engage with and what you don't. But you have the ability to make all of these different decisions that have all these consequences. And so I think that game, that game's probably worthy of a full volume in and of itself, right? To kind of brings a lot of these different threads that we have in the individual essays together, and connects it to kind of the broader context we're in right now, politically, culturally.
I think that kind of that broader context is exactly where I was thinking about heading with that. And, you know, sort of, I talked a lot about in my chapter on Gettysburg, decentering Gettysburg, right? And sort of understanding that, and of course, you as a game designer, you want the player to think that the world rests on every mouse click. You know, like that's just compelling storytelling through your game. But historically, we can pull back and know that there's a much bigger strategic, you know, vision of things. That, don't get me wrong, if things go different at Gettysburg, the timeline's going to change. But it's not the coming down to the last throw of the dice. And so I think in that same way, that what the volume is pointing to a little bit, and especially as we get into the later chapters that move into the West and move after the Civil War era into the 1870s, into the 1880s. And of course, we've got Red Dead Redemption that moves and takes on Reconstruction in this really compelling way, right? Shooting Klansmen. But then you're also going back into, you know, a state that is basically Louisiana. And sort of seeing, you know, wounded veterans sort of scattered across this Western landscape. Really fascinating reckoning with the way, lots of different ways that the war left scars on American people. Really great chapter in there on a game called Juarez that starts with this bizarre Atlanta campaign. You know, sort of defensive moment where you're playing as a Confederate soldier who you will eventually pick up on after many, many years, and, you know, inhabit that character later on as they're out in the West. But it's this connection there again that North and South was making. Like there's a far West component there as well. There's a European intervention component there as well, which is often a variable that gets thrown into these games too. But, you know, I think we are heading to a point where the technological capacity is such that we're pulling back from the set piece battle and recognizing how all of that fits into a larger strategic picture of 1861 to 1865. And also we're pulling back even from there and recognizing how this is obviously a critical moment in American history, but also one that sort of flows in. And I hope that the structure of the game, again, starting with Oregon Trail and moving into these other Western games, are sort of trying to point to the ways that, you know, the Civil War can't be understood on its own. You know, we have to have this broader vision or our understanding is incomplete.
I'm looking forward to having Jonathan Jones on in January. This will be like the third time we've talked about historical gaming, but I read that chapter and I reached out to him and I'm like, dude, we need to do something on this because this is amazing, and we know Red Dead is a huge franchise, so there needs to be something on that. So that's coming up in January of this coming year. Everybody,
Tori Olson, just real quick, kind of on that. Tori Olson's, I went to grad school at UGA with him. He's at the University of Tennessee now, but he just came out with a book teaching American history through Red Dead RDR2.
Wow.
And I think it came out in September. So it'd be fascinating to kind of put Jonathan and Tori in in the same room together.
Send me that link when we're all done here. I want to get a copy of that. So as we wind down here, I definitely have to ask both of you, what's next for both of you? What are you working on? What's happening? I'm working on dissertation chapters, so
I'm officially trying to keep myself out of projects and trouble. I'm gonna be taking over as president and CEO of the Filson in January, so I need all of my time for administration and fundraising. I am very tempted and have had some initial conversations about, and may have even developed a conference paper on a history of reenacting, because I don't think it's the efforts that I've seen done have not been done well. And as an insider, I feel like there's a lot more that needs to be said there. So if I can get my head above water and nobody takes that on before I do, that's going to be something that's going to kind of always be in the back of my mind.
Nice. What about you, Trey?
So I'm staying in the Civil War memory and pop culture vein. So I'm calling it Tailgating with Jesus and General Lee. the religious ritual, the lost cause, and Southern college football. So I'm going to grapple with how Southern college football really kind of perpetuates lost cause narratives and imagery, throughout, from the late 19th century when it becomes sort of a thing in the 1880s and 1890s, really through, I think you could argue through the present day, and some it's still a point of contention in some places, right? So that's my next project. I'm turning my hobbies into my research.
That's the way to do it, buddy. That's the way to do it. But I definitely want to thank you guys for your time, for hanging out with me and discussing the book. I want to thank LSU Press too for, as I said, getting me probably the first copy in Canada. So thank you for that. Everyone, chat, you need a copy. Playing at War, Identity, and Memory in Civil War Video Games. I made a lot of notes in here, and I'm currently thinking about building a syllabus on how we interact with the past in digital environments. And I'm sure I'm going to use some chapters how to hear for that. So thank you guys for your time. I greatly appreciate you.
Thank you.
Likewise. Great chat.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody in chat. We appreciate you. Keep reading. Talk to you soon.